So, hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson, and I'm going to talk about how the self is shaped by the narcissistic family system in this video. I'm a registered social worker with over 14 years collective experience and 5 years working as a therapist. So, I'm going to talk about how understanding the scapegoating role, and we can understand and isolate that role or that individual in terms of what they went through in terms of the ecosystem of the family. So I'm going to talk about different aspects of what it was like being in the orbit of a narcissist for those many years and how this shaped your identity and to some degree, perhaps even your destiny, at least up until this point in your life. In terms of understanding the interior world of the complex trauma that occurred for the scapegoat, there's a way to understand the internalized critic. So this is a very negative voice, perfectionist, a voice that's constantly evaluating. It's typically the case that you might have grown up with a very critical parent, let's say a father, nothing was good enough. So you spend your life trying to think that as long as I'm perfect or come off a certain way, I will earn my father's love. But realizing, I think, at a certain point that that's never possible and it wasn't really ever about you or anything that you can necessarily do. But because the child was desperately wanting that love, they say that's the only way they can get their perhaps father or mother's approval, then they have this internalized critic. This can be even after you are an adult. There's a notion of an interject, right? So you've internalized that inner voice, perhaps of your father and mother, and it becomes the inner critic. The understanding of these dynamics is the notion of no bad parts. It's not that you need to necessarily get rid of the inner critic, but it's rather listening to the inner critic and hearing it first and understanding that at least it has some usefulness, at least in the past. You can also channel that inner critic. Maybe it's just discipline or ways to listen to it in a way that's not a negative. The negative interjects are not accurate and they're not truthful because they're from someone else, usually a negative parent. So they're never a part of the self in terms of the truthfulness. In internal family systems, he talks about the 8 C's, and I'll be talking about that. The critic would be considered not part of the healthy aspect of the self, but rather something that developed from a young age due to the environment you were in and the way you probably internalized it and basically accepted the interject of one of your parents or both your parents, or could perhaps a sibling, or even a teacher. So it's just the notion that we have these, you're not hearing voices, but you're hearing your inner dialogue, and it's shaped by likely your environment and the people that were very much impressionable in your life from a young age. I just want to also talk about the role of self and healing fantasies. There's an unconscious adoption of a role self. This happens for the child who's a scapegoat, and they're hoping one day winning the parents' approval and so that they can get out of this role, or so they have both a role self, so it's like a peacekeeper or scapegoat, and the healing fantasy is the notion that you can one day heal this, but as you realize as an adult that it wasn't ultimately ever about you or something you could necessarily do, but because the child again needs control, they or want to do what they can to find love, they very much believe in this healing fantasy. And that's just according to Gibson, not something that you want to get stuck in. There's also prolonged grief and abandonment depression. Prolonged grief is often experienced by people who have been through toxic family systems, grieving the life that you never had, and the childhood you never had, and the family you never had. It's also prolonged because the family of origin makes up who you are and it shapes your identity. And these memories are very much lodged in you. And it's also something that's not seen in society. And it also goes back to Walker. So Walker has a great book on complex post-traumatic stress. Over time, these experiences and cycles you've been through have led to a not fully developed healthy self. And you probably have these insecurities or these parts of the self that haven't yet been integrated. And so it's about doing your best to integrate those parts and both listening to them and integrating them. I'll get into that in terms of internal family systems of how to unblend from parts, but that's just to take internal family systems. And there can also be pathological loneliness for the scapegoat. There's often deep shame and trauma that creates enemy number one. So there's this feeling that you're an enemy of the family system. And there's also just when you have the absence of the abuser. So if you get in yourself a romantic relationship or even a parent, there's this intense withdrawal symptoms. We could talk about intermittent reinforcement. There's also the notion that, at least according to Sam Vakkin, there's three parts of grief, and one of the first aspects is to grieve the idealized image given to you from the shared fantasy when you were with the narcissist. They have an idolized image of you, and you have to grieve that snapshot, this idolized image the narcissist had of you. That can be incredibly difficult. It's also dealing with your own level of attachment to this idolized image. So this is why getting over these situations are difficult, because you're dealing with all these different aspects in your inner world. Often they're not picked up upon. There is a lot more literature and awareness growing about all these aspects, but at least often with friends or other people, it's not always something that's well known. And I just want to quickly touch on the brain in terms of the neurological imprints of abuse. I used to work in child welfare, and we'd come across a lot of this research just in terms of children that are exposed to a lot of neglect and abuse in their home environment. And you consider this in like war-torn countries, and there's obviously levels of this, but often what people talk about is fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And so that's to go back to Walker. A lot of my clients will have either one of those aspects as a main coping mechanism or a main way that they cope and address that situation growing up in their adulthood, maybe in a romantic relationship. Maybe it's in a conflict, they might freeze, or have flight issues where anytime an argument happens or there's an emotion discussed, they tend to avoid and flee, and so they might walk away, or fight and just go into quick anger and defend themselves. And when you're in the narcissistic abuse cycle, you're also going to likely be having one or two running the show. And it's interesting because I used to have a client where his mom, he said, had bipolar, and he believed definitely some narcissism. And he would talk about how he would defend his wife and he would stand up to her and make sure that she didn't do that again thing. And it was just to know that he thought he was doing right. And I guess fight is one of the ways in which it makes the most sense in some degree, or at least it's the more admirable response, because it's like you're standing up to the bully or to the narcissist. But I think you also realize that if you're doing that, you're going to exhaust your own system because you're in this tense, like adrenaline. And you're also feeding the narcissistic abuse cycle because they probably use those ways in which you explode or get angry or say certain things during those moments as a way to still hook you in and shift the blame onto you. Just to go back to my client that I had, so he thought he was just defending his wife and standing up to his mom. But the point I think that he missed that he was still engaging in this fight or flight response. And so it was, again, not always easy, but the more that you can avoid getting yourself into these responses, the better. You're going to be less emotionally dysregulated and respond better in the moment. But families, it's not easy in these moments, even if you have the intellectual understanding. It's really checking in with yourself and knowing in the present that you don't have to have these responses anymore, but it's on learning those responses. And so some people will be always on adrenaline in their work maybe, or there'll be things in their life, let's say they're in traffic, but these responses will be occurring much more acutely usually for people who have been through complex trauma. Just learning what your main adaptive strategy has been or defense mechanism, and then learning to respond in a more appropriate and calmer way. And that's just the first checking with your body, but also having intellectual understanding and being aware of your triggers and this kind of thing. There's also research that children that are abused can have smaller orbital callosa, making it harder to shift between problem solving and crisis modes. That's according to Eddie. Trauma is not just a memory, but a physical imprint. Muscular armoring and tension develops as defenses against overwhelming feelings. A lot of my clients report somatic tension or tightness in certain areas. I spoke to a client recently about just how it sounds like she really stores in her body versus it's mental mind, like mind and body, but it very much seems to be on her shoulders. If you've dealt with complex trauma, it's unlearning that these experiences obviously aren't happening anymore. Emotionally, psychologically, and subconsciously, it still feels like a threatening situation. when you're triggered or stressed, you tend to default to these ways of dealing with things. You might clench your jaw and hold it in your shoulders. Maybe if you were told not to communicate or express yourself, you have tightness in your throat, or it could be in your gut, ignoring your intuition. So these are ways that shows up in your body, first as a child, then as an adult. It's about doing body scan exercises, slowing down, breathing, maybe doing yoga, like a physical practice. So that's ways that you can address this. And so when you live in this family, there's a family mythology. We don't talk about that. There's a dominant narrative. So in unhealthy families, the dominant narrative subverts the entrainment in family members and the equation of people with problems. And there's emotional fusion, a core concept from Bowen theory where individuals lack differentiation and they vent and have these blurred boundaries. And the narcissistic parent, they fuse with the children, especially the golden child, but they also project onto the scapegoat. But there's more of an emotional fusion and then a lack of differentiation. In a healthy family, there's going to be ability to be your own self, but in these families, often they speak as one and you have to go along with the dominant narrative. This also goes to the dual mothership model by Sam Vakkin, is an approach he talks about. And this is just how the narcissist coerces their partner or child into a shared fantasy to reenact this fusion. This is just to understand just how the narcissist is playing out these early parts of their experiences as a child. They are outsourcing and needing you to be almost like a mother to provide unconditional love. And they also idolize you like a child. And so it's this kind of dual mothership model that he understands is what's occurring within the shared fantasy. And so that's just learning to grieving that as you leave that cycle, both grieving this child part of yourself that was looking for unconditional love, but also the way in which you're parentified and act as like a proxy mother to your mom or your father. So it's also making discernment between love and control. In these families, control is equated with love. Narcissists supply obedience and mirroring. This is what the parents will do, is they will give you narcissistic supply and expect that from you. They'll expect you to be obedient, and they'll also mirror you. Maybe when you're younger, you thought that this mirroring was them really taking care of you and understanding who you are and taking interest in your life. But I think you also come to terms with the sense that they were mirroring you to get narcissistic supply, using cold empathy to understand you, see you as a target, and get their figuring out an inventory of yourself so that they can exploit it and use it to their advantage, which is really harmful, right? The fact that a parent would do this to you. But you probably equated that with, oh, my mom really understood that I like this kind of music, or maybe it's like a Christmas gift they gave you and you felt like they heard you and really understood you. But it's done in a more controlling aspect, just to keep them involved in your life, but not necessarily to support you. So that's something to make a discernment about, is the notion of mirroring as well. These families expect you to submit, obedient. Even when you're an adult, like 34 years old, right? They're still expecting this. And I've went through in the past about the idolization, devaluation, discard, and hoovering phase. And there's also the notion within this, the intermittent reinforcement. So this is unpredictable cycles of praise and punishment. It creates a powerful trauma bond, like a slot machine addiction. And there's the notion of triangulation. So this is when anxiety is reduced between two people. This could be a parent with a third, and it's typically the scapegoat. And this stabilizes the parental and at the child's expense. In that, there's a scapegoating, and so there's an active process of projecting the family's unwanted feelings, so shame and inadequacy, onto one member. And this acts as like a disposal or a garbage can. And also to take from Eddie, so he just understands there's a high conflict personalities, so he calls them HCPs. And this system is driven by individuals with patterns of overthinking, unmanaged emotions, extreme behaviors, and preoccupation with blaming others. These patterns typically exist in these families, so understand that when you're dealing with your life. So from object to subject, an integrated path to healing. The healing is not a single act, but an integrated process. Recovery inquiries work in all four quadrants, rewriting our inner world, reclaiming our bodies, our relationships, and rewriting the rules of engagement. understand the four quadrants and understand both the psyche in the interior, the behavior in the right hand quadrant in terms of how it shows up in your body, somatically and behaviorally, but then also how it exists in your relationships and within your family unit and some of the unspoken beliefs. Then you're really understanding it from a four quadrant affair, and it gives you a way to approach this from a more wholesome, comprehensive way versus some experts or approaches which just specialize in one area. So we'll just do cognitive behavior therapy, or we're just going to focus on relationship and communication, or it's okay, it's just your body and we just got to do yoga or breathe. It's not to say that those approaches are wrong. It's just that when you can engage yourself in all those areas, you're more likely going to heal and address this trauma. Often I'll point this out with clients, the notion of the head brain, the heart brain, and the gut brain. Just to understand the intellect, the emotion, and our intuition, our subconscious. I think in order for us to heal, we need to have all three online. Some clients will just engage the heads, processing and ruminating, but won't be really centered in their heart. It could be certain difficult emotions they're dealing with, but because it's too hard or hurtful for them to feel present with their emotions, they'll go to their head and try to analyze and ruminate about it. Or they might have gut issues and ignore their intuition. By engaging the head, you're making sense of what happened, understanding the theory, identifying different patterns, and challenging some of these beliefs that you have. If you're dealing with the heart, you're grieving losses, you're developing self-compassion, and you're learning to build healthy, authentic relationships. And then in terms of your gut, it's your body, your intuition, and re-inhabiting the body. So it's like trusting your body more and listening to your signals and like picking up and how your body's feeling. And it's taking principled boundary setting actions in your life as well. So that's just to understand the healing journey on a 3 head, heart, and gut level. And I just want to also talk about rewiring inner scripts. So this is from self-criticism to self-leadership. So in IFS, there's a notion of merged parts. So you basically want to unmerge from certain parts of yourself. In IFS, they have the firefighter, the manager, and the exile. Schwartz talks about the 8 C's of the self: calmness, curiosity, clarity, compassion, confidence, creativity, and connection. That's his notion of the self. But then we have the notion of these wounded parts from childhood, from complex trauma. It's likely we have these exile parts and usually a manager parts. This is a part of the self that contains it, which just goes on with your life and usually suppresses the exile part. But then sometimes there can be an addiction, like when the exile part comes out and the manager part is too much for the manager part to deal with, then this firefighter part. So it could be like an addiction or some kind of compulsive behavior that tries to calm the exile part. But usually the manager part can come back online when functioning during the day. Just understand that these parts are operating. Similar to Freud or Jung would speak about is like the ego or the persona or the id and the anima and the animus. So these are different aspects of the self. But the IFS therapy is similar to that, is that we have these different parts, and the question is like, who's driving the show? By having compassion, you listen to these parts and you don't judge them or push them away or suppress them. Rather, you integrate them and unemerge, like you dismerge from them. So you no longer blend with them, because when you're blended with them, they're more in your subject, or so they're part of your identity. So if you have a lost child or an abandoned child part of yourself, then if you're not fully aware or have made it an object of your awareness, then it's likely you're still acting out from that. You could be depressed or having a lot of internal shame. But usually if you're going to go to like internal family systems therapists, they would get you to talk about these parts and explain what was its purpose and why it shows up at certain points in your life. Then you're able to integrate it back into the self so that it's no longer exiled or merging with yourself, but rather something you're having compassion for and listening to. Another aspect of healing is to confront and reject dark aspects of the personality. So that's what the shadow is about, or rather it's integrating those parts. So it's typically a shadow, right? Is just parts that we don't like about ourselves. So we push those away, especially if we came from a family where we were the scapegoat. That collective shadow of the family was projected onto us. And it's about making that discernment between what's our shadow and what's ourself and what is not ourselves. And typically we identified with the collective shadow and believed it was our own. It makes us incredibly strong, usually very self-aware and typically very empathetic. But it also burdens us and creates a lot of tension in our life. It's a lot of heaviness because we're holding things of our own. We've also been blamed and shamed and discredited from the family system. We're also dealing with that trauma. So Carl Jung just gets you to understand that you're integrating the shadow, both yourself and disowning the collective shadow. But then you're also, things that you don't like about yourself, you're re-owning them. And so that's also just a journey, but that's something to think about as part of this process. And in terms of deconstructing the inner critic, it's using mantras and just feelings of fear, shame, and guilt are sometimes signs that we have said or done the right thing. Reclaiming the body from somatic armor to intuitive wisdom. Somatic mindfulness is to learn to befriend inner energies rather than suppress them. You can use somatic awareness to therapeutically trigger and metabolize painful memories and dissolve depression. So a lot of people recommend like a body scan exercise, and I think that's like the one of the first steps you can take is feeling your body one, but then scanning it maybe before you go to bed. And if there's tightness in your throat or in your neck, then it's breathing into those. And yeah, I would just encourage you to consider body exercises and a somatic approach in terms of your recovery. I've talked also about the notion of differentiation of self. According to Bowen, there's differentiation of self. This is a lifelong task of maintaining a self in a relationship without being emotionally reactive, distancing, or anxiously trying to control others. And this is a powerful anxiety reducer, he would say. So that's about setting boundaries. So it's seeing boundaries not as walls, but as invisible filter systems that help you sort through what's okay and what's not okay. They're meant to preserve relationships, not to end them. Building a circle of friends with varying levels of intimacy who can provide the mirroring support that was absent in childhood. This is just the notion of having a chosen family to help you with moving forward in your life with healthy differentiation. In Jay Reid's approach, he talks about first understanding the narcissist and the narcissistic family. Once you're safe and go limited or no contact, then you work on safe relationships and practicing self-assertion. Yeah, you just have to get free from it. And then when you're safe, your healing journey can occur. It's about living in defiance of the narcissist. Your body takes some time to de-stress and leave the cycle of intermittent reinforcement that was occurring and just choosing healthier patterns and habits. It's also about disrupting the human magnetic syndrome. So that's to take from Ross Rosenberg. So he said at the end, like that's when you attract yourself to a narcissist. There's this notion that we're on a spectrum. And so there's an overinflation of self and underinflation. So it can be a tendency that you attract yourself to the opposite. And so by, let's say you're more codependent or you're more, what to say, you lower self-esteem and more decompression of self, then it's just about having a healthier self-concept. His antidote to that is to magnetic attraction to a narcissist is cultivating self-love. So this is healing that attachment trauma that creates this pull. So until you address that underlying core insecurity and lack of self-worth, then you're going to likely find attraction to someone who appears confident and has it all together, but really it's this overinflation of self and this reassure, what to say, they have such surety usually of themselves that it's very much attractive to you because for you that you have never really had that. But the thing is that's usually arrogance and it's also, yeah, a level of narcissism. So it's just them think they're superior than others. And it's not something you really want to emulate because obviously it's not a healthy, sustainable sense of self, right? It's built off of the false self. And so it's just to understand that if you have a lack of self, you might find yourself for a person who over-exaggerates their self. By healing the inner trauma that occurred from a young age, and you cultivate that self-love, then you're no longer likely going to be attracted to that person. And I think that it's just like maybe in the future, right? Like perhaps you've just struggled with so many years. You're always maybe attracting someone that's a little bit more on that spectrum, but you obviously don't want to attract someone who is more extreme and really has narcissism, like full-blown narcissism, but perhaps they have a bit of narcissistic style maybe. And yeah, that's just to understand that. And these are just some things to understand if you're truly recovering. It would be sound decision making. So you're able to make discernments and you're not caught up in lack of decision making. I definitely found that with some of my clients. Maybe they just had a very dominating mother, or they were constantly in conflict with their parents. And so they might don't want to side maybe with either parent. So they struggle with decision making because they outsourced it from a young age and didn't want to upset their parent. These are ways in which decision making can cause issues growing up when you're an adult. Ability to trust. Obviously, if you've have relationship trauma from a young age, it's perhaps you're gonna have your wall up and you're gonna think, okay, all I can rely on is myself, so therefore I won't seek a partner. That's how trust can be affected. Maybe you grew up with this want and need to have your parent see you in a certain light, and the only time they would give you attention is if maybe you were achieving something. But then it's knowing that wasn't really ever to do about you or like actually encouraging necessarily, but more than you being a product of them and an extension of them. They convert you into a dead object in some sense, right? And then narcissist internalizes you as an internal object. You're always just an extension of them and merged with them. At least that's the way they saw it. But as an adult, you're seeing the world through your own eyes, free from the narcissistic internalized gaze and distorted defenses. And also, yeah, and then just coming back to your emotions, because usually at these households, you come from a very maybe emotionally neglectful household where it wasn't safe to discuss emotions, where things were very superficial. And maybe as a scapegoat or a truth teller, you try to have those discussions or emotions or have that deeper relationship with your parent, but it would always just be kept superficial, or they would chastise you or see you as a problem because you wanted this deeper relationship. That was a healthy impulse in you, but you were shamed for that. It's learning that in a friendship or a romantic relationship, working on that shame and those messages that you got from a young age. And also reconnecting to intimacy, so you're no longer averse to intimacy and do not automatically associate it with pain. And that's a way your mind, your brain, like associates probably intimacy maybe with control, or it's some way this malignant normalcy got embedded in you. You associate being vulnerable as a way that you might get attacked or hurt. So it's learning to let go of those defenses and to quiet some of those internal parts that could be operating. And finally, I just want to talk about how this can also show up in your family if you're a parent. A lot of my clients will speak about how they don't want this to be occurring in their family or with their kids. One book I read is the notion of Barbara Colrose book, Your Kid is Worth It. In that book, she talks about authoritarian parents. So in that book, she talks about an authoritarian parent and permissive parents, like a drill sergeant and jellyfish parent. And so you want to have some healthy balance between both of those because it combines warmth and acceptance with a moderate degree of control, allowing children to develop autonomously with confidence and as individuals. But if you're too friendly with them, maybe you want to do the opposite of that. So you're like, I'm just going to be more of a friend or kinder to my kids. I'm not going to be that strict ever. But then you might do the exact opposite and the pendulum swings the other way. And it can actually be unhealthy for your child if you are overly soft. You're not really giving them a lot of sense of security with that because they never really know what to expect. And especially when they're younger, it's the role of the parent to instill certain values and have discipline for the child to rear them. Whereas when they get older, you're respecting more their autonomy and individuality and encouraging their individual expression. But again, maybe you grew up with a very passive parent and very enabling parents, so maybe then you're very much authoritarian and overly strict and too rigid. That's also a challenge and a problem. Just knowing that, taking family therapy, how this lack of differentiation that occurred in your family and this emotional fusion with your parents perhaps show up in your current family situation and you as a parent. Even if you don't want it to be like your parent, you also could swing the other way, and that's also not healthy. It's about having a healthy medium. I encourage you to consider that. It's a classic book, Your Kid's Worth It. But I just wanted to explain how this dynamic and lack of differentiation can show up in your own family origin. By breaking that cycle, you're countering the lineage and how this transmissional process occurred. And ending the search for supplies, a healed parent does not need to use their child to stabilize their own ego or unmet needs. They can foster a child's individuality without threat, right? Because if you're with a narcissistic parent, they probably first saw you as a threat. So because in a sick way, they need to get this supply. And even if it's their child getting praise or something a child needs, they would get jealous of that. And they would merge with the child and also vilify the child. That's to understand that you don't need to do that anymore, right? As a healed parent. And then also just mirroring healthy conflict. So teaching children that conflict are managed by taking the other's viewpoint into account and having negotiation, not through aggression or silent treatment. I would encourage you to check out Bone Family Therapy and how he approaches this, but it's about having bits of connection and not having those four horsemen that come out in terms of criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. But it's also communicating that there's a gridlock issue usually. So there's many parts to that theory, but definitely something to think about is modeling healthy conflict resolution, because most likely the narcissistic parent didn't deal with conflict well at all. Also making the child a subject, not an object. So it's usually the case that parent objectifies you and it's really, you're just an extension of them, right? And what kind of supply you can give them. And or also as this shared fantasy, they converted you into an internal object and they didn't really see you for who you are. So the ultimate goal is to see and relate to the child as a separate, independent being with their own inner world, known as extension of the parent. So this is all things you can do to stop the cycle and the transmissional process of trauma that occurred in your lineage. In this video, covered different aspects of things to think about when, the scapegoating role. I took 4 quadrant perspectives, understanding the interior of the individual, how it shows up with the body somatically, and within the family unit in terms of lack of differentiation, different aspects of how this can be carried on in your own family of origin and you as a parent. And so I also talked about some solutions like taking the 3 brains, the head brain, the heart brain, and the gut, to understand ways to address this and approach this in your life. I also talked about a body scan exercise and different resources and books to think about when healing on this journey. So if you did like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks and have a great day.